Victory Day is very special to all Russians. Almost every family in Russia has someone who died fighting the Nazis. To talk about how that war is perceived now, more than 65 years later, I'm joined by Professor of History and International Relations Jeffrey Roberts from University College Cork, a Sovietologist who wrote a number of books devoted to the World War II and Joseph Stalin. Professor, thank you very much for being here. Now, your views are often challenging the widely accepted perceptions. Let's start with the Second World War. 27 million Soviet people lost their lives in what here in Russia is called the Great Patriotic War. How many people worldwide do actually know how big this figure is?
I think it's a shock. It's a shock to people outside of Russia and the former Soviet Union, the cost of that war. The statistics are astronomical. You compare 20 million Soviet dead with the British, it was something about less than 400,000, the same in the case of the United States. So, Soviet casualties in the Second World War dwarf the casualties of all other countries. In fact, they're as many as all other countries combined. Yeah, so I think it's shocking as well as surprising. But nevertheless, I think the sacrifices of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War are quite well known nowadays, particularly since the end of the Cold War. There's been far greater recognition of the Soviet role in the Second World War, and I think that most people globally, if they know about the war at all, would accept that it was primarily the Soviet Union that won the Second World War, made the greatest sacrifices, was the greatest victor of the war. Didn't win the war on its own by any means, it won it in association with Britain, the United States and other countries, but nevertheless, the Soviet Union was the key to victory over the Nazis in the Second World War.
But as a historian, do you feel there is a tendency to rewrite history?
Well, there's always a tendency to rewrite history, isn't there, particularly by politicians, by people who are not historians. Every country has its own perspective on the war, and every country sees the war from its own perspective, and the same is true of Russia. So for example, give one example, Russians will stress, the role of the Soviet Union in winning the war. As someone who's British, I would stress Britain's role in the early part of the war in standing alone against Hitler when the Soviet Union was a neutral country and indeed was in a kind of alliance with Nazi Germany for a while. So every country sees it from a different perspective, places a different emphasis. I don't see that as a problem. I see that's a kind of natural part of the discussion about all aspects of history that goes on.
Let's take a young generation. Is there a deficit of historical knowledge?
Very definitely, yes. Which is why I'm so glad that television stations like yours devote so much time to history. Yes, I think there is. I think there's a deficit in Russia and in all other countries.
But let's take, for example, the United States, if we're talking about the knowledge deficit. I wonder just how many Americans think that the United States won the Second World War single-handedly.
I think probably in the case of the United States, there's probably more ignorance of the general picture of the war than there is in other countries. So it's probably all of other countries in the war in the United States than elsewhere. It doesn't just in the war, and there's frequently complaints in Britain about, as you say, the Hollywoodization of the war and presenting it as though it was the Americans that won the war. Now, having said that, of course, the United States did play a very important role in the war. It was the Soviet Union's main supporter, main supplier. Nevertheless, I would say, other people would say that they should recognise other countries' roles as well, particularly, of course, the Russian contribution, the Soviet contribution to the war.
Last year, when Russia commemorated the 65th anniversary of Victory Day, a Russian research center found that most Russians believe that the Red Army, the Soviet Union, could have defeated Hitler without Western assistance. As a historian, do you think it's hubris on part of the Russians?
No, I don't think it's hubris. I think it's true. The Soviet Union could have defeated Nazi Germany on its own, but it would have taken it a lot longer and at a much greater price. And of course, it would have taken the country much longer to recover after the Second World War. So yes, the Soviet Union didn't ultimately need its allies to win the war, but its alliance with particularly with the United States and Great Britain, helped it to win the war a lot quicker than would have otherwise been the case.
Your book, Stalin's Wars from World War to Cold War, focuses on Stalin, obviously. In one of your interviews, you said he was a key historical figure of the mid-20th century, but you also said you had a lot of respect for him. Why the word respect?
I'm not sure I used the word, oh, maybe I did use the word respect. Some people accuse me of being an admirer of Stalin, which I'm not. But having studied him very closely for many years, I'm very impressed by Stalin. Now, if you want to call being impressed respect, but I'm not sure it's the word I use. I mean, basically what I argue in my book, Stalin's Wars, is that without Stalin, without his leadership, without his contribution, it's very possible, maybe quite probable, that the Soviet Union would have lost the war with Nazi Germany. I consider him to be that important historical figure. And if that's true, then of course he is the most important figure of the mid-20th century, and one of the most important figures of the 20th century itself, even more important than Hitler, I think. But I may be impressed by Stalin, but I'm also very critical of Stalin, particularly the many crimes that were committed by him and by his regime. He should be criticised and praised in equal measure. Praised for his role in the Great Patriotic War, but criticised for his dictatorial rule of the Soviet Union.
So what, in your opinion, was his role in winning the Second World War?
I think the most important thing about his role was that he held his nerve and he maintained the cohesion of his leadership and of the group of people around him. And I think he also inspired confidence. He inspired confidence not just in his own circle and among the Soviet elite, but among the Soviet population in general. So he's the symbol that holds the whole country together, particularly during the critical early months of war. But not only that, he's also the mainstay of the Soviet war effort. That the whole war effort revolves around him, around his abilities as an organizer, as an administrator, as a coordinator, as a leader. So I don't really think you can underestimate Stalin's role. I think he was indispensable, and I doubt that anyone could have taken his place.
What about Churchill and Roosevelt? How did they perceive him?
Well, they perceived him very positively. They were great fans of his. They referred to him as Uncle Joe, and the three leaders got on very well at the wartime summits at Tehran and Yalta. And that's another point about Stalin, of course. My kind of positive view of Stalin as a war leader is not unique to me. I mean, it's a view that's widely shared, not just in Russia, but also among Western historians. And of course, at the time itself, during the war, during the Second World War, there was widespread recognition of the importance of Stalin's role. So Stalin was not just the great hero of the Soviet people during the Second World War, he was the great hero of the Allied peoples as well, including, well, maybe not hero to Stalin, to Churchill and Roosevelt, but they certainly admired him greatly and appreciated his role in the war. Now, of course, that contemporary view of Stalin, very positive view, that all gets lost after the Second World War in the context of the outbreak of the Cold War and the failure, the breakdown of the Grand Alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Although I would say, for Stalin and the Soviet side, neither Stalin nor the Soviet Union wanted a Cold War, and they tried to avoid a Cold War. And indeed, after the Cold War broke out, they went to great lengths to actually to bring the Cold War to an end. So on the Western side, once the Cold War has broken up, there was a much more positive engagement with the Cold War. Whereas on the Soviet side, there was a reluctance to become involved in the Cold War and continuous efforts to revive the Grand Alliance. One of the great themes of post-war Soviet foreign policy is a desire to return to the Grand Alliance.
There is an initiative in Russia these days to officially recognize the crimes of Stalin's totalitarian regime. Some go as far as putting Stalin and Hitler on a level. Do you believe they're historical equals?
No, I don't. I think Stalin's crimes are very different from Hitler's crimes. I mean, Stalin wasn't a genocidal killer. Stalin was actually an idealist and a utopian, and he believed that it was necessary to use violence to achieve his utopia. And as part of that drive towards this communist utopia, a lot of people died. People who Stalin perceived as being his enemies and the enemies of the Soviet system. Stalin didn't kill people because of their race. Stalin had people killed because of what he saw as being their politics and ideology. Now, on balance, I think that's better than being a genocidal killer like Hitler. And of course, the thing about Stalin is, Stalin defeated Hitler. Had Hitler won the war, what would have happened? There would have been a Nazi-dominated Europe, and ethnic cleansing and mass murder, genocide on a continental scale. For me, there's no greater historical criminal than Hitler. Stalin certainly was guilty of a lot of crimes, but I wouldn't put him in the same league as Hitler.
But do you believe that's an opinion widely shared outside the circle of historians?
Well, the idea that Stalin and Hitler were equals as criminals, of course, is very much an idea of the Cold War. And it's an idea that took root during the Cold War. And there are many people today in the West, maybe also in Russia, who want to continue the Cold War in some form. And one of the ways they pursue the Cold War is through this ideological struggle, including about the war and including about Stalin and Hitler. So it's an idea that does have quite widespread appeal. But I think that, maybe not most people, but lots of people would recognise that Stalin did a lot of good as well as a lot of bad, and that Stalin, played a huge role historically, was of service to humanity as a whole in actually winning or helping to win the Second World War.
Professor Roberts, thank you for this interview.